Cold Black and Infinite is 16 stories that represent the last 5 years of my life, my writing life, I should say. And there's a little bit of everything. It's got a lot of range, but it's also a cohesive piece that has everything from zombies to cosmic horror to black-eyed kids to there's even a long form prose poem in it if that's your jam. Again, a lot of a lot of elements of various types of horror, and there's something there for everybody, I think.
Before talking about this collection of stories or individual stories in it, I want to address crossovers and connectivity and stuff, because it seems like beyond there being a connectivity between some of the stories, there's also connectivity or crossing over into some of your other books. So,
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is this something that just comes naturally to you, or you write in a way where a lot of the stuff takes place in the same universe and naturally kind of bumps into each other? Or what's the cause of the crossovers?
It's yeah, it does come naturally, but at the same time, I mean, I am making a conscious effort to introduce elements into some of my stories that have more of a direct connection to some of my novels, and vice versa. uh I like to think of it as playing in the same sandbox. um it's easier for me to work in a world that I've already established and the rules and everything than to put the time and energy into creating something entirely new and separate. um so yeah, I guess that it does come naturally, but it's my natural inclination to do that. But I'm also making an effort to build out this expanded Southland mythos that I call it, and
Mhm.
try to place as many works of fiction in that as I can. But sometimes, sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes they're standalone, and that's just how the story forms.
Yeah. In your notes at the end of the book about some of the stories, I almost got the impression for some of them that either I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. There was almost like in thinking about the other stories, something came up where you're like, "Oh, I'm going to write that," or you had more to say, or that kind of thing, where your mind was just naturally fleshing out an idea and continuation of something else. Is that accurate, or am I just reading into that?
uh Sometimes, it's not always the case. I mean, like using holes in the fabric as an example. One of the stories in the collection, I wrote that to kind of link my novella, The Final Reconciliation, more firmly to Devil's Creek. Uh, so it's the in both books, there's reference to a character's mother not being you know of sound mind, psychologically damaged. So in trying to come up with a way to more effectively link those two stories, uh, she became my focal point. Like, I wanted to explore how and why she is the way she is, and represented in those, and in turn flesh out an entirely new character.
Right
um
on.
does that answer your question?
Uh,
I tend to ramble.
no, it's cool. So one of the thoughts I had was that a lot of these stories are previously published, but there does seem to be kind of like a fit where they all kind of work nicely together. And then the thing that I actually didn't notice until I was done reading and I was looking over the table of contents was the title kind of means something in sections too. Is that kind of accurate? So there's or the table of contents implied, I guess, that there's a section that's cold, a section that's black, and a section that's infinite. Is that accurate?
Like I tried to group the stories that kind of fit thematically somewhat. Like the first group of stories, several of them had take place on holidays in the colder months, so hence cold. Um, the black section, you could interpret that several ways. It could be black comedy because there is some black comedy in there. It's also just pitch black, a lot of dark stuff in that section. And then the infinite is more cosmic horror, more philosophical, existential, and in some ways nihilistic looks at the world. But also, aside from that, like I approach the collection as like a greatest hits sort of thing. Like I'm really into music. Nine Inch Nails is a huge influence, hence the title, which is actually a line from a Nine Inch Nails song. Each like album that Nine Inch Nails would come out with is kind of considered in the fan base as an era. There's a particular design, there's a look to it, there's a style that kind of perpetuates over a span of time. And looking at all the stories that I had completed in this 5 year period was kind of like an end of an era to me. It was most of them were written in my 30s. I just turned 40 this year, so a lot of reflection, introspection, and I wanted to kind of mark this period of my life with, uh, a grouping of what I consider some of my best work. And it's also like an evolution of my writing and storytelling from the last collection I did, which came out in 2017. Um, so keeping in mind that in mind, and uh, you know, it's also, you could also look at it as the night falls. You go from the cold of the evening to the full dark to the infinite expanse of the stars above. That's probably ham-fisted, but we can roll with that. There's
No, I
many
like
different
it.
ways to interpret it.
Good. Yeah. Cool. That totally makes sense. And I hadn't really. It was weird because so thank you for the advanced ebook and everything like that. I just dove right
Sure.
into and I do this so often, was I dive right into reading something that I don't kind of pay attention to the wrappings a lot. So and I often
Mm-hmm.
even fail to acknowledge, like the cover and stuff. Like I really like the cover of this book, and the type and everything is really cool. But I usually just blow past that and I get right into reading, and I don't pay attention to the other stuff until later. So when I noticed that there was kind of sections almost, I was like, oh, there's probably something to that. I better ask him about that. Um, so yeah, that's my own failing as an enthusiastic reader, is sometimes I kind of miss bigger points.
No, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. That's something I've noticed with the early reviews is everybody's kind of got their interpretation of that, and that's a lot of fun to see.
Right on. Um, One thing that I think in planning this, back and forth emailing with you, I think I said something like, like your book is fucking me up or something like that. So this is another thing that I
Yeah.
typically fail to do, because I get deeper into like thinking about individual stuff that I kind of fail to acknowledge kind of grander effects and stuff. But like you mentioned it, there's some really dark stuff in here. There's some pretty disturbing stuff in here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like not in a way where someone might, like, in a positive way, in a he's got the best dark stuff, he's got the best disturbing stuff kind of way, not in a way that detracts from the book. So I just want to acknowledge up front, like, very effective, scary stuff, disturbing stuff, emotionally impactful stuff in
Thank
there
you.
as well. So, and obviously I'll probably talk about some specific ones when we talk about stories, but um, yeah, I just want to acknowledge up front, like, this book is a ride, and I wasn't, I don't know if I was like really ready for the ride that it was.
I
um,
get that a lot.
But I was listening to you talk to This Is Horror when you were talking about Devil's Creek, and it seems like you're not really shy about writing stuff really going anywhere, because like you talked a lot about things that were personal to you, and you talked a lot about your history with religion and stuff, and so it seems like
Hmm.
whatever, like you're not, it'll all go out on the page. Like there's not really something that you're not, like a place you're not willing to go. Is that kind of accurate?
Uh, I mean, there are certain things that I kind of, you know, cringe or shy away from as a rule, but like the, you mentioned Devil's Creek. There's a lot. There's implications of rape. There's child abuse, pedophilia, things of that nature, and like I can write about them, and because that is an unfortunate thing that happens in the world, and it's fucked up, but you can't just close your eyes and pretend it doesn't exist. You have to face it. And my goal is to approach those topics, but in a tasteful manner that isn't exploitive. I'm not just throwing it in there for gore's sake. I had this conversation with a friend not too long ago. Like, I don't consider myself an extreme writer by any stretch. That's not my jam. It's I don't like really care for reading it either. But I also come from a school of thought where if this is going to come up in the story and it has a reason to be there, there is, if it tracks with a certain kind of character that they would do this. I would try to structure the plot in a way that I wouldn't have to describe it as it's happening. But I like that's I guess if anything, and people could say this is a good thing. Some people would say this is a bad thing, but I will go right up to that moment and then cut away. Um, unless it's necessary for the story. But even then, I'm not going to like it. And
Yeah.
I'm going to try to be as careful with it and as, you know, because in certain scenes like that, it's impossible not to think of how it's going to be read and interpreted. Uh, so that's probably the only time I write with, being conscious of how others are going to perceive it. Uh, so I try to handle stuff like that with tact and respect for how heavy the content is.
Yeah. And that
So
oh, sorry.
I it's okay. I've written before about this. I don't look away. I think it's the reader will know when I'm looking away. It's disingenuous. So I try to but just because I'm not going to look away and I'm writing about this stuff, I'm going to treat it you know as carefully as I can. Like, I'm not just going to throw shit to the wall and man, look at this fucked up thing that happened, huh, deal with it. I'm not going to do that. Like, and there's going to be some literary reason for it to be there, and if I can't provide that reason, then it's going to get cut.
Yeah. Um, so the obvious example from this book would be the Gods of Our Fathers, where
Mm-hmm.
there is an instance of assault that happens in the story, and I think my impression of the story is exactly what you said as far as how you handle those situations. Um,
Yeah.
like tactful, there's a reason for it. It's handled respectfully. All those types. It's not gratuitous. It's not weird. And as a reader, yeah, I think that that's one of the types of situations that it's harder to read. But when the story um, has a bigger message, and it has an empowerment to it, or whatever, like again, like if it's just a part of the story that's justified to be part of a good story, then obviously like it's beneficial as a reader to kind of get the experience of the story. And yeah, I feel like that story, you handled it the way that you said you do. That was going to, and it's always hard for me to kind of talk about these topics because I feel like there was an era or there was a time where like assault was like a shorthand to getting a story started, or like a crutch for
Hmm.
writers to just kind of like have a reason for bad things to happen. And so the fact that I feel like that's being moved away from and people are being more thoughtful about what it actually means is good. And I think that your story, Gods of Our Fathers, is the type of story I think that, you know, should exist if that's going to be a part of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Um, and uh, that one, oh, I'm trying to remember because outside of like that particular element of it, I think it was just one of the more engrossing stories where I feel like I just kind of fell into like the world that was being built, and there was a
Hmm.
really nice pet goat that was part of it. Oates, I think Oates the goat.
Yeah, Oates the goat. My my agent. She she was sad about the goat. A lot of people are sad about the goat, and I was sad about the goat because I don't like to write about harm coming to animals. I can't watch that on in movies and whatnot. But the context of the story with this little girl turning to quite literally the gods of her her mom and her grandfather, like the old ways, so to speak, more pagan in nature and more primal. That's something that was done back in the day. You sacrificed something to show your devotion, and in some cases, especially with those older religions, it was a blood sacrifice. So I tried to maintain that, and then to a greater extent, just try to build out this underlying like sense of paganism and older religions older than we know, uh, perpetuating throughout the South. Because
Yeah,
I grew up in the South. You listen to my This Is Horror interview. So I grew up in the South, and I've unfortunately never been out of the country. It's never been something that I could afford to do, unfortunately. But I'm obsessed with Stonehenge
mm,
and standing stones in general, and that whole like druidic aspect of ancient culture, and that's something that has always intrigued me even since I was a child, and just how different it is compared to what I was raised in. So I've wanted to take that element of you know European lore and try to transfer that in my fiction to the places I grew up. So, Gods of Our Fathers kind of, encapsulates that a lot. I wrote that in the middle of writing Devil's Creek, so there's a lot of similar language that carries over,
hmm
similar tone, I think.
nice. Yeah, and the story just kind of gave me a feeling of like, obviously, it's like someone going through just horrible adversity and finding their power, in a way.
Hmm.
Or at least that's kind of where I walked away from it with kind of
Yeah,
like a,
I definitely see that.
yeah, like a, I don't know, because it's the tricky thing whenever I read stuff that has religion in it or spirituality in it. I was raised
Hmm.
non-religious, and so I'm it's like I'm looking at everything through a window. Like I can't touch it, I can't feel it because I've never had that experience before. So it's at a remove
Yeah.
for me. But there, I definitely got a feeling of like um, if I could say, don't just accept things, like find what's the right thing for you, kind of a feel to it as well.
Yeah, yeah, and like this, it's about not being able to fit into the world that you're given. It's this little girl who was raised a certain way, and now the people she loved most are gone, and her the guardians that are supposed to protect her are actually abusing her, harming her, physically and emotionally. And it's she's being bullied, and it's about standing up to those bullies and finding the power in yourself. And in her way of doing it, she takes it upon herself to follow these steps that she was told or taught by her late mother and grandparents. And it's something that's always resonated more with her than the religion that her father is trying to force her into.
Yep.
There's a lot of ways you could read into that, and you'd probably be correct.
Right.
uh, but I'll stop there. I won't just spell that out for you, readers. You got to
Yeah.
work for it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think is it's one of those stories where you kind of imagine what the future for the protagonist is, and so my thought is like maybe we'll see her again sometime, in a different way or
Uh,
something like that.
you might. I can't say for certain that we'll ever see her again the way she is in that story, but I will say uh, she is referenced in the incident of events of that story are referenced in a new story of mine that's going to be in a October Screams, a Halloween anthology that comes out later this fall.
Nice.
I've got a story in that called the Puppeteer of Samhain, and it is firmly rooted in the Southland universe, and there is reference to the events of Gods of Our Fathers.
Very cool. So at least a glimpse of another reference to her. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll definitely be going back to her at some point in shorter form, but it's just a matter of the right time and right story.
Yeah. Um, I'm probably just going to jump around. I'm probably not going to hit stories in any specific order, but one of the ones toward the beginning, Midnight in the Southland. Oh my god! Just to make sure my brain is working properly. That's
Yeah, Midnight in the
the radio
Southland.
host, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Great. I just want to make sure
yeah,
that. So Midnight in the Southland.
it's okay.
Uh, basically, a guy is, part of the story is like a guy reminiscing of this radio show that aired as in his childhood, and it was the conspiracy theory kind of host kind of thing, like what was that dude's
Yeah,
name, Art Bell or something like
Art
that.
Bell.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
Art
like,
Bell, Coast to Coast AM.
yeah, in the tradition of that kind of thing, and um the thing that, so I have to imagine that this is probably something where tagging that type of a character where it's like an Art Bell thing conjures memories in the people who read it. So I never listened to that,
Mm-hmm.
but in my weird, my childhood, my father lived in Alaska, and I barely ever saw him. But when I did see him one time, like that was the thing that he was listening to, like late at night or whatever. And when I was like trying to fall asleep, and so I've heard it, and it's just the crazy, like talking about
Mm-hmm.
like black helicopters and things like that. And so that conjured up this very specific, like weird going to see my father I barely know in the middle of like the wilderness of Alaska kind of thing. And so now I'm tagging on that
Uh-huh.
experience to the experience of reading this story, which has like this very specific meaning to the protagonist. And so I have to imagine other readers probably have that same experience as well. Is this have you has anybody talked about? Oh yeah, I remember this dude kind of thing.
There's definitely that nostalgia is intended. Um, I first learned of Art Bell through the band Tool. Actually, back in the late '90s, early 2000s, they had a track on their Lateralis album that was basically a recording from a show, one of Art Bell's shows, and
Mm.
I was never in range of being able to listen to the show live. Uh, but you can track down recordings all over the internet, and that's how I came to immerse myself in the strange world of Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM. And at the time when I wrote that story, my wife and I had just returned from a visit with friends in Kentucky, and they had taken us to this ferry, the Valley View Ferry, on the Kentucky River. And I owed a story to Kevin Lucia for an anthology, and I wanted to write about the ferry, but I was also listening to a lot of Art Bell shows, from the '90s at the time, and I wanted to find a way to marry the two. And like there was a lot of, I was kind of in a weird place mentally and emotionally, and what came of that was Midnight in the Southland. It was originally called Night Drive, um, until you know Gus Guthrie became a thing in the story and his show Midnight in the Southland, and in a way that gave me a voice through which to speak about the greater, you know, southern region, the Ohio Valley, Kentucky and Tennessee are it's a very strange place, and I can't really. I wish I could articulate it better than that. Like it just going back. Like I haven't lived in Kentucky for almost 20 years. I live in Pennsylvania and have for a long time. Um, but more and more when I return and to visit, or just most recently I had a book tour there. Um, there's just this general oddness in the air, and I don't know how else to describe it. But like it's this, maybe it's the feeling of being the other and people recognizing that you're the other. Uh, I mean, but growing up, you'd hear, if you hear somebody call your name, don't answer. Call your name at night in the woods, don't answer. There's stuff like that. It's like there's stuff very unique to the Appalachian region. Um, silly things like, if you go to this one place and drive around 3 times, your car is going to stall. That's what I heard about the Devil's Creek. Devil's Creek's a real place, by the way. Um, if you drive around the circle 3 times in the woods, your car is going to stall, and you're going to see shadowy figures in the woods, and stupid shit like that. But the oddness comes from the fact that so many people just accept it as facts, and they just accept it as part of living in the South. Like this is a part of life down south. Like you have these weird, mysterious things that happen, and it's just something that happens. There's no question if there are ghosts. There's no question if there are, demons and devils and creatures in the mountains and the woods. There's always this innocent acceptance of it, and they're these things are almost revered in a way, or at least respected. So, and I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm talking down about Southerners, because I myself am one. It's just that for all the for all of the diehard Christian roots in that place. There are a lot of elements to the South that are very, very pagan, for lack of a better term. There are very many unexplainable things that they can't attribute to God or the devil in a Christian sense.
Hmm.
And so to loop all of that back around, when I think, that's what I think of when I think of the South. I think of all the weird shit that I grew up hearing. I think of all the weird shit that I've, experienced myself down there. And so I wanted to try to encapsulate that in a story where I had someone who's kind of like an observing figure adding commentary to all the strange things. And that's how Gus Guthrie was born. Midnight in the Southland radio show was born, and I married it to this guy who's kind of having to start over and find himself again. And that nostalgia, there's almost like a sadness to it.
Yeah.
And you know, I remember going on drives when I was in college at night because I needed to get out of my head for a while, especially after a bad breakup. And I took those experiences and tossed it in a pot with everything else, and voila, we have a stew going. And that's where Midnight in the Southland came from.
That's the oh, shit. I had a thought. Hang on. I'll get it back. You threw me off with the stew going thing. Um, I'm assuming that's an Arrested Development reference.
You're welcome.
Um,
Oh, that totally is.
yeah. Uh, the damn it, totally threw me off.
You have to leave this in, by the way.
No, yeah. If anytime anybody references Arrested Development, it stays in. So a couple of thoughts I had were when you were talking about the way people in the area are, and like the seeming contradiction between like being very religious and then also very kind of pagan. From like my personal experience and knowledge, it seems like that is in a non-contradictory way, where like they're almost like their belief doors are kicked so wide open that like it all makes sense to just kind of like be open to, of course, the like the random superstition, or of course like you do this to prevent this from happening, and that doesn't conflict with my religion, which is very scripted and
Mm-hmm.
and structured, right?
Sorry,
But
what? You cut out.
oh, sorry, I know I said that very vaguely, but like it's what you said is in a way where they don't see a contradiction between being very devoutly religious and then also being open to their
Right.
superstitions and their stuff like that.
And I think it's, in a way, it's kind of like how, in history, when, especially when, Romans became Catholic, formed a Catholic Church and everything. Like, you had this appropriation of all these pagan ideals and,
Yeah,
followings and superstitions and everything, and they found a way to incorporate it into their belief structure. And that's how we have Easter,
yeah,
that's, that's why you know, we married the symbolism of fertility to the resurrection of Christ, which is still bizarre to me. Um, that's I look at it a lot in the same ways. Like, these things were there before people came to the area, or at least white Anglo-Saxon people came to the area.
right.
The indigenous folks, the native folks they already knew, and the Anglo-Saxon folks decided, okay, you know, how can we worship here and still respect these boundaries in a way? Like, I'd
Yeah,
like to think that's the case, but anyway, I'm waffling. Um, that's why to a greater extent, I look at the South as this weird place because of that, and how, you talk about Mothman in West Virginia, and it's just accepted as fact. Yeah, that happened.
Right. Yeah.
I saw him the other day. He was, flying over the ridge and stuff like that. It's just an accepted fact. People don't question it. They don't, and I respect that. I don't. I'm not saying that to be derogatory to folks who live down south. Not at all. I respect it.
So yeah, that just knocked loose a thought in my head, and I know we're kind of going off on a tangent here, but I saw this, and this could be apocryphal. I don't know, but it was something that it made me think. I saw someone probably on like social media or whatever saying something about how like the region of the Appalachians you could trace back to being um, part of Pangea, part of like it goes back very far. So like geographically, it is
Yeah,
a place that has a very undisturbed history, far far back in the history of the planet, in a way where um, there hasn't been catastrophes that have changed the geography. It's always kind of been there, so it's just kind of always been around. So I wonder like if there's like an extra like mythos or creepiness or depth to people's thoughts about it. It has something to do with the fact that like it's been like that for fucking ever.
yeah. I mean, that's you kind of hit upon something there that I'm slowly getting to in my fiction. Like that, the fact that this whole region is older than we give it credit for, or give it's older than we respect. Really, like this is it's got, that area's got the largest cave network in the world. It's got the oldest mountain range in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a distinct lack of certain types of fossils, and I forget the names of them. There's a lack of fossils in those mountains because those mountains predate the existence of those creatures.
Right, right. Which is
And
crazy.
like, so, which is, amazing and creepy all at the same time. And, that as a backdrop for the supernatural and all the weird shit that happens, like, you couldn't ask for anything better. The,
Yeah.
so that's something I'm slowly building to in my work, is, talking about that and kind of linking it all to that. Spoilers. Um,
Oh man.
but that all is going to figure into the greater picture that I'm painting here. Could be a couple of
Awesome.
years, could be decades, I don't know, but I'll get there.
The body of work is pointing in that direction. Um,
Yes.
well, then that makes me want to talk about cosmic horror because, like, as we talked about when we were talking about the different kind of sections of the
Oh
book,
yeah.
there's plenty of elements of cosmic horror in the book, and so, but not in everything, obviously. So, like, I would say there's like a one-off kind of really quick one, which I think is fantastic, which is Solve for X, um, where it's just this really quick story where I love the presentation of it because it's like it's someone who's a babysitter. A kid shows up at the door.
Hmm.
Something seems wrong, and it's her just fighting against her instinct to not do the thing. And then it goes on from there. But it was a great little just like morsel of a story that kind of just lives on its own
Thank you.
and was really cool. It gave me vibes of the Stephen Graham Jones "The Babysitter Lives" audiobook that came out like a little over a year ago. I don't know if you've had a chance to check it out, but very
I haven't
spooky.
actually.
Yeah, very spooky babysitter situation. And maybe it's just because I listened to it recently that it was like top of mind. But there's something about being a babysitter where there's like weird vulnerabilities and danger that I think don't exist in like everyday life or something. But it's a good setting for
Hmm.
a scary story.
uh It's kind of funny you mentioned Steven because he actually has a story with the same title. I didn't realize that
Oh
till
yeah.
after I'd already put the collection together. Um, I don't think it's about a babysitter though, which is good. But like that story began as something for middle grade children,
Oh.
and it didn't get accepted into the anthology that I'd written it for. So I basically went back and approached it as a story for adults, and kind of played up on those fears of overstepping or making the wrong assumption, and also black-eyed children are creepy as hell. I don't know if you're familiar with that phenomena.
Oh, that came up
uh,
with someone else I was talking to once, and I don't remember who. But yeah, please talk about that.
yeah, like black-eyed children are these kids that they're not really understood. If they're like, a lot of people think they're just like an elemental force, and these kids will show up at your door, or the the guy who put out the first his story, and there's speculation as to whether or not it's fiction or if it really happened, but the guy who first told his story about an encounter with these weird children happened back in the 90s on an internet forum, and they actually the guys at Astonishing Legends podcast got him on and interviewed him about his encounter and everything. And in that story, basically, he's going to pay his internet bill, and it's next to a theater. The internet place is next to a theater. He puts it through their nightly Dropbox. It's like 10 o'clock at night. To give you an idea of how long ago this was, Mortal Kombat was showing at the theater. And he says that while he's in his car, he's sitting in his car and he's writing the check, these two like preteen boys walked up to his car asking for money so they could go see the movie. But and they keep asking him, "Will you roll the window down? Will you roll the window down?" And something seems off, but he at the same time he feels compelled to do what they're asking. But then as he starts thinking about it, it's like, well, the last movie started an hour ago.
Mm.
So, he's telling the story, and that's the general gist of a black-eyed kid encounter, or BEK as they're referred to online. You will encounter this strange child on a threshold, and they want to come inside. They want to cross that threshold, and nobody really knows what they intend to do. So, I approached it from like, well, what happens if you do let them inside? What if they don't have black eyes? What if they just don't have eyes?
Right.
And things like that. And they also will say things like there was one accounting where I don't recall. I think I might have actually written this into the story, where this black-eyed kid is like has an ice cream cone and asks for some ketchup to put on it, because it's like whatever they are, they're trying to pass themselves off as human, but they're
Right.
obviously not, and therefore they don't realize the context of what they're saying. Uh, so yeah, like that whole phenomenon just creeps me right the fuck out, and I love reading about it. I love, to a greater extent, the creepypastas from which they originate, but
Yeah. All right.
so I
So I
tried. That was
remembered.
my take on the black-eyed kid story.
Nice. I remembered who I was talking to. And did you read Max Booth's Abnormal Statistics collection of short stories that came out recently? Are
I
you aware?
have it. I haven't gotten
Yeah.
to it yet. Sorry, Max.
There, yeah. There. Well, it just came out earlier this year. I mean, come on. But he's got a black eyed kid story in there. And then when I had him on my
Nice.
podcast with we did a crossover with This Is Horror. It was like the three of us talking, and we talked about that phenomenon. That's where I heard about it before. Yeah, yeah, real creepy stuff.
Thank you.
But and that's that was my tangent from talking about cosmic horror. So there is a good amount of cosmic horror in the several of the stories in the book. What's your
Hmm.
history with cosmic horror? Is it something that you like reading, or is it something that just fits well into this universe you're creating, or what is it, or all of the above?
The universe, the universe I'm creating is a cosmic horror universe. Like my goal there was to, like, well, this goes back to the beginnings of Devil's Creek, way back in 2007 when I first had that germ of an idea. Um, I wanted to create my own mythos that exists alongside Lovecraft's mythos. Now, Lovecraft himself is a very problematic figure, um,
Hmm.
but what he created has influenced probably most horror in the 20th century into the 21st. Uh, a lot of Stephen King stuff is influenced by Lovecraft. I mean, his presence is felt everywhere, and so I wanted to kind of create my own mythos adjacent to that. Like all of his stories take place in New England.
Hmm.
Well, what if you had cosmic entities or cosmic experiences that were in a landlocked region and not just on the ocean? That was my initial thought. And so, I've been reading cosmic horror since I was a teenager. Uh, so it's always kind of been a huge influence on me in my work. And, now with, we're living in the best time for cosmic horror fiction, really. I mean, you got Haley Piper, you got Langan, you got Laird Barron, um, Simon Strancis. Jesus, I could go on and on and on. But my point is that that's all been a huge influence on me and my horror. There's always been some kind of cosmic element to everything I've written. Like there's always this, you know, dread that comes from acknowledging your place in the universe and realizing just how tiny and insignificant that is. Uh, but it's also those moments where, you know, regular persons going on about their day, and then the great eye of the cosmic universe just kind of looks at them, and suddenly they're not the only insignificant speck; they are the focus, and then all sorts of bad shit happen. So I forget where I was going with that, but yeah, the cosmic horror is it's been a big, wide influence on me my whole life, really, because I can relate to that,
So
just in terms of understanding your place in the world and how insignificant it is in the grand scheme of things.
and that's so as you started talking about that, that was going to be my follow-up question, and you kind of described it now and like a minute ago. But like as someone who's not as versed with cosmic horror, I've always just kind of had impressions based on the small amount of stuff I've read that that's kind of what it is like our it's contrasting our existence with like kind of something that we can't possibly understand, like that kind of a thing. It's that
Yeah,
juxtaposition.
it's
um
it's kind of like the focus of a human mind, like is kind of human mind is self-centered in
yeah,
nature, right? We are the center of our own universe, and then when you come face to face with something that is beyond your comprehension and puts your entire existence in question, uh, to me, that's cosmic horror. It's that feeling. It's that utter feeling of loss and dread and you know madness, really.
yeah, and almost like a vertigo of like understanding or something, maybe.
Yeah,
um
Like
Yeah,
I can't, I forget who said this, and I can't attribute it to them. And if anyone listening knows, then please correct me. But like cosmic horror, somebody said, to fully really explain and understand cosmic horror, like you need to think about a child or a figure with a magnifying glass focusing the sun on, a bunch of ants on a sidewalk. On cosmic horror, we're the ants.
yeah.
Like it's
That's
very bare bones understanding of what cosmic horror is. So
I think it's an effective analogy though. um, so you mentioned some. I don't want to. I don't want to jump away from the cosmic horror thing. You mentioned some people who were influences on you, but outside of Lovecraft, so you mentioned Langan. So The Fisherman, right? Wouldn't that be in the realm of
yeah,
cosmic horror?
yeah,
I remember reading
yeah,
that,
definitely
and
cosmic horror.
that book just fucking kills it, man. What other kind of
Yeah,
contemporary examples do you think are really good examples of like contemporary cosmic horror that's happening right now or recently?
uh, Laird Barron. I mean, he's a he's a household name at this point with cosmic horror. I mean, his shorter fiction, like his collections, definitely lean toward cosmic horror. Like he's more into the crime thing right now, which is cool. Um, his Isaiah Coleridge series is really good, by the way. Just as a quick aside. Uh, so Laird's a big influence. John's a big influence. Haley Piper's stuff is amazing. Her, The Worm and His Kings, and the sequel, Even the Worm Will Turn, are fantastic cosmic horror. Um, you got the works of Douglas Wynne, Jim Chambers. Uh, God, I'm drawing a blank on so many people right now. But
That's the thing about getting put on the
like,
spot. Yeah.
yeah, like, I mean, no disrespect to anybody I'm forgetting, but you know, a lot of those names have been influences on me in my work. And but equally, I also try to take whatever. I also try to look at what they're doing and then try to do something different so that I'm not like, you know, just entirely following and and trying to mimic what they do. I'm trying to create something original as well.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's there's a wide array of cosmic horror folks out there. You know, I wouldn't exactly call Thomas Ligotti entirely cosmic horror, but Ligotti's also a huge influence. Ligotti and his protege John Paget, big influences there. Uh, Ligotti kind of strays into heavy philosophical, horror, if you could even call it horror, like existential, and at times extremely nihilistic dread.
Hmm.
Um, and it also kind of walks that line into the weird and fantastic. They're very. If you were to like create a Venn diagram of all those different genres or subgenres, there would be a lot of overlap.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking too that
Yeah,
like it seems like people I know of that are into stuff like either even just reading or consuming cosmic horror really kind of fall into the creepypasta stuff, like talked about the Black Eyed Kids and stuff like that. Um, and I think that creepypasta is so fascinating because obviously it's like a contemporary phenomenon in a lot of ways, but it's just like the back rooms and stuff just seems like it's like a mind bending things aren't the way they should be kind of thing. So it seems like it's almost kind of parallel or similar or having similar characteristics maybe to some of the stuff that you'd get out of something like cosmic horror. But I could be talking out of my ass because I don't know either
No,
subject
no,
too
I
greatly.
think I look at creepypasta like the natural evolution of our, you know, campfire storytelling. Like,
Yeah.
here's a story about something that happened to someone I know or someone I know's cousin. you know, it's kind of like, it's like telling stories is in our blood. You just look at cave paintings. Like you go back to our earliest origins, and we've been telling stories. So like I see creepypasta as just this. It's the next level of telling telling stories, telling warnings, telling people about this thing that might have been experienced. Uh, and in that case, I mean, there's a lot of creepypasta that's garbage, but then from time to time, you get a real gem. You get a real
Yeah.
gem out of it.
So there's a couple stories, and we talked off the record that I think the best way to handle this is not naming them, but there's a couple of stories that have elements to them where there is either a conscious or subconscious kind of one person controlling the environment and causing bad or weird things to happen. And I can't think of other specific non your story examples of this, but this has always been kind of a type of story that I've been drawn to. There's something about finding out that like something bigger is happening behind the scenes that is, making us like the trauma of a person has caused me to be in this scary situation or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if there's a question there, but I just really like that premise of like either it's known all the way throughout that someone is kind of the architect of my situation I'm in, or it's a clever reveal at the end that all this time it's been someone's dream or something. So yeah, I don't even know if there's a question there, but there's a couple of stories that have that kind of thing to it, and I think it's a really effective kind of like premise for a story.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, and I know obviously because we spoke off the record, but I know the stories that you're referencing. One of them was a puzzle of sorts. Like I kind of knew where it was going, but I wasn't quite sure how to handle it because the whole thing I wanted to feel like a nightmare. I wanted it
Mm.
to. It was heavily inspired by Thomas Ligotti, um, and I just wanted it to have that same nightmarish quality where is this really happening? Like this all seems bizarre and strange, and is there some greater machination behind it? And what if the the call is coming from inside the house, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's a pretty roundabout way to sum it up, really. Uh, the call is coming from inside your head.
Oh yeah, there you
And
go.
the other story you mentioned uh, was also heavily influenced by Harlan Ellison. I have no mouth and I must scream. Just the approach, the language, just how you have this set group of people stuck in a really bad situation and how they try to understand and come to terms with it and how they try to get around it and everything. And sorry, readers, I'm sorry if I'm being vague, but I don't want to spoil the story for you. Neither does Rob. So
Yeah.
that's the best I can do for you.
So, but that brings up something in storytelling that I think is pretty. I've been thinking about lately a lot with horror specifically is that there's certain types of stories where the people need to learn the rules in order to try and survive the situation, and then there's a whole lot of play with whether the rules actually are the rules and like that kind of thing. But like yeah, you have a story in there
Yeah.
that does that, where there's like and the thing about the learning the rules thing is that means we as readers learn the rules, but then we also know how to expect things to either go, or our expectations to be subverted or something. So there's something about that learning the rules thing where I feel like I get hooked into those stories really well, because now I'm looking for, oh, this person did this, that means this is going to happen. Or I'm looking for, where's the turn where the rules aren't really what the rules are, or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's definitely an element that we're seeing in horror these days. Um, I'm not a horror scholar, unfortunately, so I can't really. I wouldn't even know where to begin to try to come up with an answer to why that's happening or why that's an element in horror. Um, Other than maybe it's a device that is used to represent how not in control these people are of things. Uh, Something to that degree.
Yeah. Yeah, that would make sense. Um, yeah, it does seem like it's a more recent phenomenon, and I wonder how much of that has to do with. And I'm not, but we need to like get an actual horror scholar on the phone or something. But like, wonder how much of it is that there is kind of a meta kind of self analysis in a lot of horror now, where, like since Scream and stuff, part of a slasher is acknowledging what happens in a slasher, like that type of thing. So now, um, you can't help but acknowledge the mechanics of the story sometimes when the story is being told.
Yeah, like the mechanics of the story have become the story itself.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's and I love Scream as much as the next person, but at the same time, it's like, well, that movie is only about the mechanics that work within the context of a movie. Like
yeah,
there are plenty of slasher stories out there where they don't follow those rules. There isn't a final girl or guy. The slasher wins, and you know,
yeah,
or
yeah. That's
the
an interesting
horror
thought.
that the slasher has perpetrated on them. It's nobody really wins because this person may have survived, but they're just irrevocably damaged and will never be the same again. And
Hmm. Which is interesting because I feel like now there's almost like evolutions in storytelling with horror, because you do see a lot of like horror that is based around dealing with trauma. Like that second new Halloween
mm-hmm.
movie was all about the town's reaction to the trauma that happened 40 years ago. So like even dealing with trauma is now a part of the horror story. So I think it's almost like the evolution of horror is a cycle of, you know, what horror is or something. I don't know. That I don't know if that made sense, but
Like I no, it does. Like I mean, I wrote a novella called Scanlines a few years ago that is entirely a ghost story, but it's also an allegory for depression and the
mm,
recursive nature of certain traumas. And like I think we can use horror as a vehicle to discuss these bigger, more present and dangerous things.
mm-hmm.
Uh, we can use that as a vehicle to give, to open the discussion. And that's one of the great things about horror is that it can be, horror. The horror is there to get your attention. Once it's got it, once it's got its hooks in you, then now here's the subtext. Here's what it's really about. It's just
Yeah.
like good horror and good science fiction does the same thing.
And I I'm just going to reference. I know I did this on another episode of my podcast. I can't remember who I was talking to, but because I talk about horror a lot, my girlfriend at one point just said to me like every day in a mother's life is horror or something like that, or every day in a woman's life is horror, and I was like, you got me there, because that's absolutely
Yeah,
true. So Yeah, yeah. I like that horror can absolutely reflect the terrible things that people actually have to deal with in real life and stuff, and give you a way to reconcile them or think about them, or that type of thing too.
Yeah.
Um, because my refrigerator repairman's probably going to be here pretty soon, probably going to kind of wind down, but I want to just say, why are mannequins so creepy? I just want to say that, and I want to see what you have to say about that.
It's the uncanny valley principle.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, that's about as scientific as I can get. I mean, I'm gonna butcher the concept, but like the uncanny valley is it's like a graph, and the closer something gets to look to being human, the more repulsive we find it. And so, like, you've got in terms of like animation or creating a representation of a person. Take an android for example. It looks like an android. It looks like an android, and then slowly the closer it starts to resemble human features and habits and the little things that we do, like we can recognize that okay, it's doing all of these things, but it's not a person, and
Yeah,
we inherently find that repulsive. So a mannequin, you've got this human-like figure, but it has no, well, preferably it has no like detailed features like eyes or lips or anything like that. Like the ones that are very much lifelike that have like I'm sure you've seen them where like the mouths are like really wide open, like they're supposed to be
yeah.
laughing, but they look like they're fucking screaming. Like it, uh, like that, like that is creepy because it looks human, but it's not.
Yeah,
And that to me that suggests, well, if that is so ingrained in us as an instinct, then what the hell did we encounter way back in the day? That looked human but
yeah,
wasn't. uh
yeah, yeah. That's a good
so
point.
that's my theory on mannequins, and that's why I will use them unabashedly in fiction, because they are fucking scary.
To great effect too. And the reason I brought it up for people who are listening is we've all gone to the magic show, closes out the collection, and there is an element of some things happening with mannequins that shouldn't be happening. That just is creepy as hell. And when you see a mannequin and you realize it's a mannequin, I feel like there's almost like this inherent feeling of like there's danger, because if it does something a mannequin can't do, I'm fucked or I'm in trouble or something like that. So I definitely got
Yeah,
that from that story for sure. Um,
thank you.
all right, so but zooming out, it's a ton of really creepy, scary stories, and you definitely cover a lot of ground. I didn't go over some of the other stories like what's the name of the one? The one that's very directly connected with Devil's Creek.
Oh, holes in the fabric.
Holes in the Fabric. Yeah. Um, like I felt, yeah. I mean, I don't even know if I have a cogent thought on that, but just like I kind of addressed early on in our conversation, I feel like there was a lot of I wasn't ready for the story kind of feelings when I was reading those stories, but that one specifically, Holes in the Fabric, definitely made me go, why didn't you read Devil's Creek, and when are you going to get around to it? Because it gave me a peek into a story that I was like, and then side note on that, I was recently listening to Talking Scared's one of their end of year episodes, and I'm fairly certain that whatever. When did Devil's Creek come out? It's 22, or it had to be,
So
or
Devil's
21,
Creek was originally published in 2020, and
2020.
then
Okay,
the re-release through Cemetery Dance came out in January this year.
okay, yeah. So I can't remember. It was one of their like end of year things, and someone brought up Devil's Creek, and I think that's what it was. I heard someone talking about it, and I believe that's the context I heard it in, and
Well,
just singing the praises of
I
it.
know Neil brought it up with his interview with Sadie Hartman
Oh,
recently.
that's what it was. Yeah, that's what it was then. Yeah,
That might have been it.
that's what it was. Yeah, and like that hooked me. I was like, oh, I'm reading this other book, and why did I never get to this one? But that story for definitely like was like, hey, buddy, you got to go read this right now because it made me feel like there's a lot going on in that book that sounded interesting.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, calling out like Devil's Creek got a ton of praise in that conversation between Neil on Talking Scared and Sadie. Sadie, who's fantastic by the way, and her book is a really good kind of guide to kind of contemporary horror too.
Yeah,
Um,
and it was an honor to find Devil's Creek and its pages. Like that was huge for me. So
yeah.
thank you, Sadie, again.
um, but overall, I know I kind of rambled about, and we didn't cover all the stories, but I think that I just want to say that it's a collection that even though it's got kind of some disparate elements, it does feel very cohesive, and it scared the crap out of me a lot. And it really showcased your talent as an author. So thanks for reaching out to me and offering an early look at it. I really appreciate that.
Sure, no problem. Thanks for reading it. Thanks for making the time.
And just for listeners who are interested in checking it out, so the release date is the end of September, correct?
Yeah,
26th?
26th of September.
Okay.
Yep.
And if there's, by the time this airs, your window for your signed pre-orders is probably not going to be open anymore, but people can pre-order directly through Cemetery Dance, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. And I will make sure I link to that and support Cemetery Dance because they're fantastic and better than going through Amazon.
Yes. Thank you.
And I'm just going to cut in before we end it because I know I kind of did the whole we're ending this thing. Happytime Yuletide Massacre was such a cool thing, and to kind of set it up for listeners really quick, a woman's going back home around the holidays, and as she's headed home, she's thinking about how she's got kind of reputation for like every time I go back home, I fall in love with someone, blah blah blah, and then she stumbles upon just carnage and like a massacre in her hometown, and the reason for that is just super entertaining. So like I feel like that was, I don't know, I want to say one of the more lighthearted stories, but with just a ton of carnage and gore in it. But I was really entertained by the idea. And it
That
was
was
just cute little, like, if someone took over Hallmark and like the Hallmark Channel and just decided to go completely in the opposite direction, I feel like that's what it would be.
I wrote that story for Gabino Iglesias and his the Hall Dark anthology he curated a couple of years ago, but I sent it in right under the wire for the deadline, and he never got it.
Oh, that's too bad. Oh,
so
man.
I just put it aside and saved it for the collection. So thank you. That's one of my favorites too. That's the one I've been reading when I've done live readings. I've been reading from a section of that.
Yeah.
It tends to go over pretty well with audiences.
Yeah, it's a great story, and just kind of I felt bad that I didn't mention it because it's just such a fun, entertaining, gruesome thing.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so I just want to say thanks for joining me and giving me an opportunity to read a bunch of awesome stories. And now I feel like I've got homework to do because I got to get back and check out Devil's Creek. I got to work it in at some point between all the other episodes of the podcast I'm doing. But I really appreciate, first of all, meeting you and getting a chance to read your stuff.
Likewise.
And you taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you. I was going to say thanks for making time for me on your platform. I appreciate it.
So we got Cold Black and Infinite coming out. Is there anything you're working on at the moment that we can look forward to?
Yes, I'm in the process of rewrites of a new novel called The Sundowners Dance. I pitched it to my agent as the movie Cocoon meets The Color Out of Space. And so I've been working on that. pretty heavily the last couple of months really, and hoping to get that out on submission before the end of the year. And once I finish those rewrites, I'm jumping back into Revelation Road, which is a proper follow up to Devil's Creek. It's not a sequel per se, but it's the next major installment in that mythos of stories.
Awesome. Well, looking forward to getting those down the road as well. Again, thanks so much for joining
Thank you.
me. And that's all. I'm just going to cut it right there.
All
I think
right.
we're good.
Thanks, man.